Hafade, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Guam Congress Building. The Committee on Health, Land, Justice, and Culture is now called to order. Today's Wednesday, July 19, 2023, and the time is 8:40 a.m. In compliance with the Open Government Law, notices for this public hearing were published in the Guam Daily Post and on the Government of Guam Public Notice portal on Wednesday, July 12, and Monday, July 17, 2023. Notices were also sent by email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets. The hearing is being live streamed on the Guam Legislature's YouTube channel. For individuals testifying, please speak your name before you testify so that we can record that along with and it will be available for transcription. We have only one agenda item this morning, that is Bill number 116-37 COR. Sponsored by myself, Therese M. Terlaje, an act to amend Section 61304B7 and 61310 of Chapter 61, Title 21, Guam Code Annotated, and to add a new Section 10104D8 and 10104D9 of Chapter 10, Title 22, Guam Administrative Rules and Regulations relative to strengthening and harmonizing government agency enforcement capabilities and ensuring best mining or quarrying practices. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my colleague, Senator Terlaje. Thank you, Senator, for being here. So I'll begin, as a sponsor, I'll just briefly introduce the bill. So this bill, 116-37, was introduced after extensive research and collaboration with government regulatory agencies in previous oversight hearings and correspondence, and they have assisted in identifying gaps, inconsistencies, and problematic areas in Guam's laws regarding how quarrying and mining are permitted and regulated. I want to thank all of them for their help and for their forthrightness in this process. And I know that a lot of this took a lot of time, and this hearing was originally scheduled for the day right after the typhoon came, so we had to postpone it, but I want to thank you again for all the work that you did prior to that. So the bill proposes 5 things. One is to clarify the intent of conditional use extractions in agricultural zones and limit, the word says extractions now as a conditional use, and we want to limit that to biological extractions only. And this is one of the recommendations we received during an oversight hearing. The bill also ensures that mining and quarrying do not bypass the Guam Land Use Commission and the ARC, or Agency Review Committee review process, by placing it as a conditional use in M2 zones. M2 is industrial. It provides a mechanism for more scrutiny for permits that allow clearing, grading, grubbing, backfilling, excavating, and embankment that exceed 5 acres. It requires special permits for mining and quarrying. It authorizes rulemaking and amending of rules for the Department of Public Works and Guam EPA so that they have clear authority to address some of the issues they have brought forth. On April 6, 2022, the Committee on Health, Land, Justice, and Culture convened an informational hearing to gather and receive information on existing laws, agency regulatory permitting, and environmental guidelines for mineral extraction on Guam. Regulatory agencies, including Department of Land Management, Department of Public Works, Guam Land Use Commission, Guam EPA, the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, the Department of Agriculture, Guam Waterworks Authority, the State Historic Preservation Office, and WERI appeared before the committee to testify on the types of permits applicable to mineral extraction, the processing of permits, the regulatory and enforcement responsibilities of their respective agencies under federal and local law through grading, excavating, quarrying, or other means to extract minerals on Guam. There have been unsolicited offers to government agencies for additional mineral extraction, including property where the Guam Raceway is at, the Lahuna, and Fadian. And currently, under Guam law, mineral extraction is allowed in M2 zones outright in accordance with 21 GCA 61310A3. Additionally, mineral extraction has also been allowed in the past as a conditional use for agriculture zones as part of the extractive industry and has been interpreted by land management over the years. The Bureau of Statistics and Plans testified at the hearing that under conditional use in an A zone, it is, quote, grossly misinterpreted, unquote, and that extractive industry is for biological extraction and not for minerals. BSP stated that extracting minerals from agricultural lands will permanently damage the land so that it will not produce agriculture. BSP stated that it would not concur with any proposed conditional use or zone changes that would be non-consistent with other land use types other than what they would recognize as M2 zones. Another gap discovered in our current laws was identified in that the Department of Land Management testified that mineral extraction is allowed in M2 zones outright, which would not require approval from the Guam Land Use Commission. However, Department of Public Works testified that they do not move on a permit for mining or quarrying unless approved by the GLUC. Guam EPA testified that another gap in the regulatory system was how operations are identified and in the permitting process wherein, quote, applicants are clearly engaged in quarrying but claim that they are not, and the land use permitting body has stated that they do not know how to respond or to make the determination themselves, unquote. Additionally, Guam EPA further added that the definition of quarrying and surface mining would help resolve this issue and place it back into the realm of land use determinations. Currently, Guam EPA now flags 20 to 50 acre projects with large cuts as quarries. These outfits had been permitted as clearing and grading. The Guam State Historic Preservation Office recommended a separate mining or quarrying permit since that would give a focused review of those requests. The SHPO also noted that there has been at least one notice of violation for significant loss of an historic site involving mineral extraction, and at the time of hearing was still working on mitigation efforts. GWA testified that a water well located near a quarry had to be shut down because it produced cloudy water, but since the quarry closed down, the well cleared up and they were able to bring it back in operation. GWA has no regulations in place that govern the depths of quarries. WERI also suggests that standards for closing quarries should be looked at, and DLM recommended harmonizing the Natural Resources Board and the Guam Land Use Commission so that there is one standard for mineral extractions, whether on public or private lands. It's my hope that we can further these particular discussions as we collect more information from our regulatory agencies and conduct further research. Department of Land Management has cited 2 permits for quarrying in agricultural zones, with one applicant applying to be rezoned to M1 to formally align its current and future operations in accordance with its master plan. As of March 17, 2023, Land Management advised that their conditional use application is being held in suspense pending the zone change application. In response to an inquiry by the Committee on Land on March 17th, Land Management sent a letter identifying 3 legislative approved quarries, although they've been unable to find the public law that authorized 2 of them. So we've sent a request for this information to the compiler, and we're still pending that response. The letter also notes, the letter from Land Management also notes that DPW operates 2 quarry sites in accordance with Public Law 2218, in Dedido, the Northern Rock Quarry, and in Inalahan, the Southern Rock Quarry. Since late 2021, Guam EPA began flagging clearing and grading permit applications that appeared to be quarrying. In that time, they've identified at least 12 clearing and grading permits that exceed 3 acres, 10 permits at 5 acres and above, to include Hawaiian Rock Products and Smith Bridge with at least 1 notice of violation. There have also been at least 16 notices of violation between 2018 and 2021 for clearing and grading, including Smith Bridge on May 17 for performing grading, clearing, grubbing, embankment, filling, excavation, and other earth-moving activities across an area just over 29 acres without a grading permit starting January 2018. Property is located next to the former Guam Raceway. The penalty for this violation was $125,000, which is the maximum civil penalty authorized under 22 GAR 10114B. The company filed an intent to appeal, admitted to the accusation in part. I hope that Guam EPA can update us on this process to see if there may be any gaps that need closing as well. Other notices for lack of EPA clearance or permit include Other companies, Hansel Phelps Construction, UMS Equipment, RC Builders, Landscape Management Services, UMS, Chu Wook Park, JT Pacific Development, and Primos Heavy Equipment. Other violations were related to storm runoff and other erosion control violations, including Samsung. These and other notices of violation can be found on the Guam EPA's website and were placed there in accordance with Public Law 35-6, which was a bill I authored to ensure that the public would be made aware of these violations, and I commend Guam EPA for their compliance and to continue to be up to date on that posting. I want to note that some of the notices, however, that were posted included a report and some did not, and just a standardized form for violation. Additionally, on June 21, the Bureau of Statistics and Plans submitted a letter to the committee recommending the following: defining biological extractive industry as, quote, any extractive industry which includes harvesting of flora in an A rural zone that is intended to be used as raw materials for other purposes. The extractive industry must not have detrimental effects to the long-term biological functionality of the property to provide future production of agricultural goods, unquote. Other of their recommendations included that the M1 light industrial zone may be preferred zone type to allow for mining or quarrying over M2, as commercial operations can operate in an M1. M2 also prohibits residential uses. Assess the utility in coordination with the regulatory, planning, and land administration agencies in creating a limited M1 zone that allows the applicant to mine or quarry, but that maintains functionality of the property to be consistent with features that support residential or commercial future uses. Agency involvement to outline the workflow and procedures to screen, analyze, and render a decision on a new zone type request that will require an administrative lift. Continuing with the Guam EPA's recommendations, our involvement of agencies to map out the permit workflow is essential in understanding how to implement multi-jurisdictional oversight of factors contributing to natural resource protection. Adding language to allow for regulatory agencies to set and determine the threshold of sustainable fresh water could help protect our freshwater resources. We will be discussing all these recommendations today. Both Guam EPA and Department of Land Management have recommended that agencies who have jurisdiction over these matters meet and on a continuing basis. The agencies, however, have made it clear that the threshold between what is considered grading and what is considered quarrying needs to be more adequately defined in order to be more adequately enforced, and the enforcement gaps need to be closed. So the bill does not resolve all the issues that we have identified relative to mining and quarrying. However, it resolves some of the glaring problems with Guam's current vague and inconsistent laws and rules and definitions as testified to by our regulatory agencies. So again, it clarifies the intent of the conditional use extractions in agricultural zones and limits that to biological extractions only. It ensures that mining and quarrying do not bypass the Guam Land Use Commission and the Agency Review Committee review process by placing it as a conditional use in M2 zones. It provides a mechanism for more scrutiny for permits that allow clearing, grading, grubbing, backfilling, excavating, and embankment that exceed 5 acres. So that's the threshold that this bill sets. It requires special permits for mining and quarrying. It requires rulemaking and amending of rules for the Department of Public Works and Guam EPA so that they have clear authority to enforce and address some of the issues that they have brought forth. I believe there is an immediate need to resolve these issues, to protect the health and safety of the people of Guam, to protect our water wells, and especially our aquifer by harmonizing Gulf Guam's enforcement capabilities and ensuring best practices for mining and quarrying. The bill was introduced on May 11th, 2023, was referred to the Committee on Health, Land, Justice, and Culture on May 15th, 2023. will now receive testimony. And I want to thank all of you again for being here. I'd like to also recognize my colleagues for being here. Senator Joanne Brown, thank you. She's Vice Chair of our committee. And Senator Chris Barnett, thank you for being here, colleagues. So, I think there's room enough for all of you who signed up to testify, who want to testify, to please come forward. There was one comment from BBMR. Their fiscal note stated that absent information such as the cost of these special permits from the affected department and agencies, the Bureau is unable to prove an estimate of the potential revenue from these special permits. It should be noted that the subsection does not identify a specific fund that such revenues from special permits are to be deposited. All right. Maybe we'll begin with Guam EPA. Mr. Cruz.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for being here. Jesse Cruz, the Environmental Monitoring Analytical Services Division Administrator. I just say the Acting Administrator, Michelle Lastamosa, had a conflict this morning, so she's not here. And Captain Bearden and I are here to address. So Captain Bearden will read our testimony this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. Captain Brian Bearden, U.S. Public Health Service, assigned to Guam EPA as the Chief Engineer and Water Division Director. So just before I get started, we have a draft testimony that we would have signed by Michelle later and provide that to you. My intent was to read this. In addition, we also provided some draft responses to your preliminary questions. So is that okay for you? Should we just read through our draft?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Guam EPA supports the intent of Bill 116. Oh, sure, not close enough, thank you. We support the intent of the bill, 116-37. Upon review of the proposed legislation, we respectfully suggest that you consider taking a different approach rather than creating a new permit type for quarrying and placing responsibility for developing regulations and administering this program with Guam EPA and the Department of Public Works. We suggest strengthening the existing land use approval processes under the zoning law. Ultimately, the controversies surrounding quarrying activities stem from questions surrounding land use, which distinguishes such permits from other types of building and grading permits. Our position is that the laws and regulations of Guam EPA and DPW, in conjunction with federal regulations and permitting systems, already contain sufficient technical provisions to address the design, construction, and operating issues surrounding large earth-moving activities such as quarrying. These existing provisions include, but are not limited to, the size and phasing of large sites, the steepness, height, and depth of cuts, the height and steepness of stockpiles, controls and prohibitions on erosion and the discharge of sediments and stormwater runoff, and a host of administrative processes requiring the submission, review, and approval of technical documentation, including design plans, geotechnical investigations, site management plans, and engineering reports. We do not believe that the additions to the Guam soil erosion and sediment control regulations proposed under sections 3, 4, 5, and 6 are necessary to accomplish the stated goals of the bill. And in fact, we believe these additions would further complicate and confuse the process. What we believe to be necessary is the creation of clear definitions within the zoning law, which would empower the Department of Land Management and the Guam Land Use Commission to enforce their existing land use permitting system. This system includes a robust public component that provides reasonable assurance that the concerns of neighboring landowners and the public in general will be heard and taken into consideration. Based on our experience over the past several years, the main issue seems to be that persons who intend to engage in quarrying activities attempt to avoid the land use permitting process by claiming that their activities are not quarrying, but instead constitute grading for some future land use. Based on numerous conversations with our staff, DLM reviewers have conveyed that without a definition of what constitutes quarrying, they do not believe they are in a position to question such claims, and thus DLM approval of DPW building or grading permit applications is granted without the requirement to obtain a zone change or conditional use permit through the GLUC. Through this loophole, the developer is able to avoid the public processes associated with the land use permits and instead is permitted solely under the DPW building and grading permit system, which, as briefly mentioned, above is primarily a technical review process and does not contain a public component. Thus, large earth-moving operations are permitted, which results in permanent and severe impacts to the environment, aesthetics, and property values, without ever giving the neighboring landowners and/or the general public any say in the decision. Unfortunately, based on our observation, this approach has become the rule rather than the exception, and we have seen numerous such applications for so-called grading activities over the past few years, which would clearly trigger any reasonable definition of quarrying. Strengthening the zoning law to better define quarrying and other similar earth-moving activities would provide the justification for DLM to flag applications for such activities and ensure they are permitted through the existing land use permitting processes under Guam law. Such an approach will ensure that this loophole is closed and the public is protected without the creation of an entirely new and unfunded permitting system within DPW and Guam EPA. Our office would be happy to work with the legislature to assist in crafting such definitions and revisions to the land use permitting laws and regulations. Additionally, there are possible improvements to Guam EPA's regulations which would complement such changes, including adding requirements for post-quarrying restoration and reclamation, as well as restrictions on the steepness and height of cut slopes. Our agency would be happy to work with the legislature to develop such additions in conjunction with changes to the zoning law. In summary, Guam does not support the proposed changes to 22 GAR Chapter 10, but does support the overall intent of the bill and would strongly support changes to 21 GCA Chapter 61 and related regulations to strengthen Guam's existing systems regulating land use and close the loophole that is currently being exploited to avoid this system. We hope that we have addressed the additional preliminary questions provided to us in your original invitation. If not, we are happy to discuss further, and we do have some answers to your preliminary questions if you'd like to walk through those. Okay, I'll go ahead and move into that. So your first question was, are there any changes or updates to the data that Guam EPA provided in our April 26, 2023 letter? Can we walk you through some areas of concern for the permits we listed or the NOVs we issued? Again, our primary concern with the current permitting of large extractive earth-moving operations is the lack of a public process, which results in the creation of permanent scars to Guam's landscapes, as well as hazards to life and safety without providing neighboring property owners or the public in general an ability to have a say in the permitting decision. But if you have any specific questions about some of those cases, I'd be happy to answer them right now. I'll just move on. Your next question was, do you have any recommendations for the definition of quarrying or quarry or quarrying? We do. We worked on a potential definition that could be included. It would be a combination of a couple of dictionary definitions and then some tests that would be applied. And our basis for this is there's a case that I was involved in the CNMI in 2008, and I have here the court record where I served as a witness for a very similar situation where a developer, a contractor, was clearing a piece of property and grading it down. They created about a 30-foot deep hole, and they said that it was to create an operating yard for themselves, but they were going to use that material over a period of 2 or 3 years to be basically a quarry. The administrative hearing officer had some very excellent, well-crafted findings on why this particular operation was a quarry and was not just grading. And we have based our response on that. So with that introduction, I'd like to read to you what our response would be. So we would propose 2 definitions, one for quarry and one for quarrying, straight out of Merriam-Webster. That's one of the findings of this case, was that any reasonable person can define what a quarry is and make a judgment. It's usually a fairly obvious thing. The word quarry means an open excavation, usually for obtaining building stone, slate, or limestone. Again, that's from Merriam-Webster. The word quarrying is the business, occupation, or act of extracting useful material, such as building stone, from quarries. And then here's the regulatory language or the legal language we would recommend to be added to that to help make a determination, to help especially the reason for this is to help the agencies make that determination so that they don't have that difficulty they have right now where somebody comes in and tries to propose something different to them and puts pressure on them, whatever, and makes them not want to call something a quarry. So here's what we recommend, and this is just a start. In determining whether a proposed earth-moving activity is quarrying as opposed to grading for some future land use, the following 3 major factors shall be taken into consideration. A finding that an activity constitutes quarrying may be based on any combination of the following. The first, the size and duration of the proposed earth-moving activity. Quarrying involves the extraction and hauling of a large volume of material over a long period of time, months to years, during which the excavation of the property is the main feature of the project. Segmenting a larger project into multiple smaller earth-moving projects shall not be allowed as a means of avoiding classification as quarrying. Okay, sorry. Awkward page break. The second point is the efficiency and appropriateness of the grading design. Excavation for the purpose of quarrying is typically excessive and inefficient for any other type of future land use. Quarrying involves massive excavation as its primary feature, as opposed to grading, in which the excavation is only incidental to the construction of the ultimate use. Grading design involves the efficient use of labor, material, and equipment, such as the relocation of soil and rock from elevated areas of the site to lower areas that need to be filled, rather than the creation of a massive excavation in which all material is hauled away for use elsewhere. Efficient grading of a site usually results in a balance of cut and fill volumes, with little to no need to haul or dispose of excess soil or rock. Efficient grading of a site may also include the creation of multiple cut and fill terraces rather than a single large excavation or fill. Additionally, the topographic features and the bare stone surfaces left behind by the massive excavation operations associated with quarrying are intrinsically unsuitable for many types of common land uses such as residential subdivisions or commercial properties. And the third factor is the creation of a substantial commercial benefit. If the project proponent would obtain a substantial commercial benefit from the excavated material, whether in their own construction projects or through the selling of the material to other parties for use in construction, the proposed activity meets the definition of quarrying, regardless of the final proposed land use. So that's our recommendation for a regulatory test that could be added to those regulations so that staff are able to hold their ground.
Thank you. I'd like to be able to discuss that more fully.
Sure.
Is it okay if we make copies of it?
Absolutely.
Oh.
And we can provide you a copy of the CNMI case as well. Here.
All right. If we could make copies, and we'll move on with the other testimony, then we'll come back for questions
Okay.
to EPA. Thank you. All right. Bureau of Statistics and Plans.
Half a day, Madam Speaker. My name is Edwin Regis. I'm the administrator for the Guam Coastal Management Program, and I'm here to read the testimony submitted by BSP Director, Ms. Lola Leon Guerrero. She sends her regrets for not being able to be here. This memorandum that she did submit in written testimony was prompted by questions that were submitted to us, and we certainly thank you for the extra time to help refine our thoughts on the prior discussions leading up to this. Before I begin, I just want to personally commend you and the committee for having the courage and the bravery to take this initiative on and take this issue on. I think it's certainly long overdue. I'll begin by reading our written testimony. Hafaday Speaker Terlaje, thank you for reaching out to the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, BSP, to provide information regarding Bill 116-37. Please find the information the Guam Coastal Management Program has research pertaining to your request dated May 20, 2023 to Mr. Edwin Regis, GCMP Administrator. The first question that you asked, is the bill consistent with land use policies and what are our recommendations? So our position is that the bill is generally consistent with the North and Central Land Use Plan. As you know, the North and Central Land Use Plan is approved by law under 5 GCA Chapter 1, Article 2. The policy that is consistent with is policy LU-1, establish the following land use categories and allow for future development as established in Figure 2, our future land use maps. This is the PDF document that you can find on the website. And that future land use category is industrial. And I'll just briefly read. Industrial lands are those lands designated for a variety of industrial uses and agricultural, commercial, and non-residential uses compatible with industrial uses. Typical uses include manufacturing and processing of wholesaling, large storage and transportation facilities, light industrial and industrial commercial uses. Mineral extraction is also permitted in the industrial designation. Prior to development, mineral resources uses must demonstrate the quality, type, and available quantity, development, and environmental constraints and other qualitative assessment considerations. Discussion points and on question 1, and this is referring to section 2 of the bill. And as you stated earlier, we are of the position that mining and quarrying can be viewed as the most destructive use of natural resources because those resources will be gone forever. However, there are instances where mining and quarrying can provide benefits for future use that provide public benefits or public good. The M1 light industrial zone may be the preferred zone type as it allows for mining or quarrying over M2 as commercial operations can operate in M1, and M2 also prohibits residential uses for good reason. Some of the cons to the M2 that we see here is that the future uses such as commercial establishments, and these are some of our observations with existing commercial entities, such as Don Quixote and the village in Sinajana, would have to apply for an M2 zone for their commercial establishment. And I don't know if you remember the village in Sinajana, that used to be a hill. And so they quarried that down, they graded that down to now the commercial establishment is right along the southern route. So it increased ingress, egress, allowed for that facility to be built, as well as use the quarry material. And so I talked about public convenience. The final height of Don Quixote, in terms of that establishment, protects aspects of visual quality. So if you think of how Don Quixote built downward to use the, they built their structure subterranean. This allowed them the final height to protect visual quality aspects such as skyline, and so we're still able to see even like the cliff line, the Tizen cliff line. And so those are instances where they quarried and they used the material for other purposes in addition to, from what I gather, also for their facility. More of our residential and commercial uses are allowable in an M1. However, the drawbacks in which higher property taxes could be required in those zones potentially could widen the void of achieving affordable housing and affordable goods and services. I'm going to move on to discussion point on question 1. We're proposing to assess the utility of a new zone type. Again, this is just a brainstorming idea at this point. But in order to further and refine that, we need to assess the utility in coordination with the regulatory and planning agencies and land administration agencies in creating perhaps a limited M1 zone that allows the applicant to mine or quarry but maintains the functionality of the property to be consistent with features that support residential or commercial future uses. Agency involvement is necessary to outline the workflow and procedures to screen, analyze, and render decision on how to review and regulate a new zone type, so still much more work needs to be done to define those processes and standards. And we will certainly need to go through some kind of feasibility assessment through a public process. I'm going to move on to question 2. It says, do you have a definition of biological extraction? And I'm going to read kind of a slightly updated version that we have submitted here in writing. So biological extractive industry, and this is just again for consideration. Any extractive industry which includes harvesting of flora in a rural zone. So in context here, the biological extractive industry is the conditional use in a rural zone that is intended to be used for raw material for other purposes. The extractive industry must not have detrimental effects to the long-term biological or geological functionality of the property to provide future production of agricultural resources. Again, that's just a definition that we are proposing as an example. And the rationale is that when we define biological extractive industry in statute, it provides clarity in which the standards can be contrasted and with and clear conclusions that permitting levels can be drawn. I think that was an amended. So essentially, we want to be able to define biological extractive industries so these standards are clear and that permitting individuals can draw clear conclusions. I'm moving on to question 3. Is there any action that would need to be taken by BSP under its own regulatory authority outside of the ARC review process for clearing and grading of properties over 5 acres? So our position is that BSP's assessment will be focused on the land use compatibility with the Guam 2050 sustainability plan indicated in the land use maps. So that's going to be our role. It's on central planning, and that's articulated by statute. Discussion points on question 3 continues section 4, 5, and 6 of the bill. We believe that the promulgation of rules and regulations are an executive function subject to the administrative adjudication law. While we support the intent of the establishing appropriate regulations of mining and quarrying to protect Guam's natural resources, rules should be developed by an agency under executive direction that involves agency collaboration where it involves multiple jurisdictions or interests over the same resource. And the rationale is the development of well-written rules that have been integrated into the permit workflows need to be worked out by agencies, in which clear standards must be developed so that regulators understand clear objectives that need to be met, as well as clear lines of authority for each of our agencies. Suzu Samasi, and I'll stand by for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Regis. Is DPW? Weary? Oh, please proceed.
Thank you, Senator. Before the typhoon, we got the documents, and we have a new interim director, and we wanted to check out what was listed in the document, and it pointed out to FDN. So we did look at it, and from our past experience, we've learned so much from doing terrain analysis and also hydrologic analysis of any sites that are to be developed. We learned so much about it, especially for determining where runoff happens, and we've created a map for it, and we actually focused on the Fadian site because we thought that was the discussion. We found a flank margin cave over there, right in the bottom, and so sometimes, we remember what happened with Marble Cave and that whole situation, and if there's a natural resource there, or some landmark or anything of concern. The question was, can you provide any recommendations to the bill? Terrain analysis are always good, before you do any activity, and maybe at least we could point out where there could be an impact, or if anyone missed anything, fractures and things like that, direct connection, maybe would it impact discharge to the coast through the groundwater routes and things like that, or it would stuff a recharge area that's very significant, and things like that for the aquifer. And like I've been saying, we learned a lot from that, and something we've never seen before in the past 10 years, and we've developed the skill to, with the new maps that are involved, LiDAR-based DMs, and even field trekking and verifying. We don't just refer to the maps, we kind of look at the big picture and then go in there and make sure it is what we think it is, or if it's not. Those have been valuable and also quite a learning experience. And I remember Jensen, I've worked with him for a long time. Quarries make him excited, and he's our geologist and our director before. And, whenever he sees a quarry, we got to pull him out of there because he's a geologist and he just loves looking at these cross sections, and nothing beats learning about our limestone bedrock than a quarry. But I haven't talked to Jensen in a while, and one of the questions is, do you have any updated insight since the information hearing attended by Jensen last year? Well, our interim director right now, Ross Miller, he's traveling, and he should be back by next week, but I could request that. I think Dr. Jensen, if we give him a chance, I think by next week he could put together a statement concerning this.
Thank you. Could you please state your name for the record?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nathan Habana.
Habana.
Yes.
Mr. Habana, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Director, Agriculture?
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity, Speaker Terlaje and senators present. I would like to echo the sentiment of Mr. Regis in that we feel very grateful and appreciative to you for making this a focus and working to improve the statutes and regulations that we have in relation to this. And while we do support and appreciate the intent of the bill, we respectfully seek the opportunity for the departments and the agencies that are granted the authority to amend the regulations through the AAA process, a process that we believe will provide for greater community input opportunity. And we would like to work together with the legislature to do so in more detail. In response to some of the question that your office sent to us with regard to our ability to explore the areas surrounding the quarry and our authority being limited to the endangered species protection, we have been able to determine from data in our forest action plan that native limestone forest represents only about 1/5 of the remaining forests on Guam, and it is the most rapidly declining type of forest on our island. And limestone forests support more threatened and endangered species and important cultural species than any other habitat on Guam. And to say that it would be difficult to convert quarry back to forest is a gross understatement. It would be near impossible, at least within several lifetimes, ours and that of our children. We seek to add to the agency's authority to assess sites before quarrying to determine what important species or habitat complex exist within that area, so our island does not lose the higher quality forest areas, the last of our higher quality forest areas. Additionally, we would like to, we believe that language should be added to define stockpiling material and filling material to ensure that those materials have no negative impacts to the environment. And regulations for stockpiling and filling should address methodology that will not hinder the functionality of the limestone substrate and support the northern aquifer. We would also like to impose stricter regulations on where the boundary of the quarry should be limited above, the mean high tide watermark near coastal areas, to include a vegetation buffer that must remain intact within a certain spacing that we would determine as a group to be appropriate, as well as above the amount of space above the current highest tide sea levels. And I know that there's been conversation many times before about the use of grounded glass to incorporate as a replacement potential for limestone within the mixtures that are required for our roads. And perhaps that's a conversation we can revisit, given that sustainability has been the trend and research focus for the last decade at least. So I'm sure that technologies have been updated and changed and evolved since the last time the conversation has been had. I think I have other sentiments that our team has shared with me, but I'd prefer to stop right here and just reiterate that I think what would be really meaningful and effective would be for us to gather as a group and with the legislative body, if you so choose, but to discuss at greater depth how we can strengthen the rules and regulations that we would need to impose. I'll leave with one last point, that in the proposed or amended or added list of those who would be included to grant permission on the special permit, the Department of Agriculture is not included. We would like to be included as part of that special permitting group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. Mr. Johnson? Could you turn the mic on? Yeah, thank you.
Where is that? There? Okay. Yeah, half a day, Speaker. Terlaje and the staff and the senators. My name is Jerry Johnson. I'm the president of Hawaiian Rock Products, better known as HRP. HRP, put my glasses on, operates 2 quarries in Guam and 1 in Saipan. We employ about 400 employees in Guam and 80 in Saipan. Next month, HRP will celebrate its 65-year anniversary of doing business in these islands and operating our rock quarry in Fidian. Our quarry is a true quarry. It's not a grading of a grading plan. It's been operated as a quarry since the very beginning, and it provides the needed materials for the construction industry, for houses, roads, airport runways. We basically supply all of the different types of customers on the island. We don't just do work with the military or government agencies, but we supply all customers. My comments on the bill are, first of all, the 5-acre. I question where that 5-acre limit came to become from, because I don't know of a quarry in the world that only has 5 acres. I think it should be limited to what controls you have in place to comply with all the laws, and not have a 5-acre requirement. It's just something that has to be dealt with in future opening up of quarries. I don't think you should have a minimum acreage on the thing. I kind of agree with, I do agree with Captain Bearden on, we do have a lot of existing laws and government regulations that we make our best attempt to comply with them all, and they are enforced, and we pride ourselves in not having many violations of these laws. Things come up now and then, but we make sure that we do follow all the regulations. We have MSHA, OSHA, Guam EPA, alcohol and tobacco and firearm for our explosives. The fire department, investigates. Guam EPA and monitors our deep wells that we need to wash the rock for our washing operation of our aggregates. So I'm not sure your bill adds any additional requirements to what's already been regulated. We have a serious problem in the construction industry, and that we're running out of rock. That's a known fact, and it is a fact in our Fidian quarry. We've been trying to conserve the rock that we have there, and we've been doing these other grading projects that you're talking about, where there is material that can be used from those projects and used in our products. And I still contend that those are grading projects that follow existing a plan for the end use. The ones that we worked on, they all do that. But it's helped salvage or extend the life of our quarry in Fidian by being able to do that and bring those materials and process them at Fidian. We have not operated our quarry in Jigo for many years, but we're getting down to the point where we have to start using that material and haul the material to our Fidian quarry to process. And so we're under the process of re-permitting that right now. I'm not sure, we own that property, and it may be zoned agricultural. So, and the extraction industry on that property has gone, longer than I've lived. I think almost 60 years they've been extracting from there under the extraction provisions. We have to get a conditional use permit for that every 5 years, but if the law is changed the way you're talking about, we would have to rezone that to M1 or something to continue, and we're actually planning to move to that quarry real soon. So you've all seen the latest projects that have come out under the NDAA, but there's almost $2 billion worth of projects for FY 24, and that can equate to a significant amount of aggregate that's needed. And both our quarry and Smithbridge Quarry have limited resources, so there will be a need to expand quarries. We hope to expand our Fidian Quarry with private property adjacent to it, but that will be a quarry. I mean, it's not going to be a grading. It's going to be used for, building materials, and we'll have to follow whatever regulations are in place at that time. But I understand all your concerns about what's, the quarry business and what all the concerns on the environment and everything, but we assure you that we're going to address all those concerns when we do the expansion of our quarry or open a new quarry site. So I commend you for that, but I really don't think you need a new law that's to govern things that are already in place by Guam EPA and the federal regulations. I'd like to invite the senator and speaker and to come out and visit, our Hawaiian Rock quarry to show you what controls we have in place for air emissions, for, erosion control, so we don't, we're right on the ocean. The last thing we want to do is have runoff into the ocean, and we've worked 65 years to prevent that from happening. We do keep a buffer between the quarry and the ocean with a nice limestone forest, and we don't intend to quarry that portion of our property. We want to maintain that limestone forest, but I would be happy to give a tour to the senators to come out and visit our quarry site and see our operations. 5 acres, it takes us almost 240 acres to do what we do out there. Of course, we've been quarrying it over 65 years, so some of the area has been quarried and is overgrown already from what we've done in the past, but it would be my pleasure to give a tour of the property. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate you being here, being one of the legitimate quarries on Guam.
Thank you.
DPW? Mr. Romeo, please state your name for the record.
My name is Randy Romero. I'm from the Department of Public Works.
I'm sorry, can you speak louder?
Randy Romero, Department of Public Works.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry the director could not make it. He couldn't get out of his doctor's appointment this morning. So I'll be providing some testimony on his behalf. So in general, the DPW is in support of this bill, considering that some minor revisions need to be made. For example, what we compiled on Section 4, subsection 10104, D9, we recommend that we include the Land Use Commission. Let me reread this. This is the revision. Mining or quarrying shall be approved by the Guam Land Use Commission through a notice of action and will require a special permit to regulate by the Department of Public Works. Guam EPA Department of Labor, Land Use Commission, Bureau of Statistics, Department of Land Management, GGN Survey Division, Department of Agriculture, Department of Parks and Recreation, Historic Preservation Office, Contractors Licensing Board, and the Chamorro Land Trust Commission. So those are the inclusion that we would like to see onto that. For the other regulatory agencies to ensure that these areas are suitable for the intended purposes. So a lot of the, as Mr. Bearden pointed out, is that a lot of the applicants are not truthful in what they're putting in as far as their scope of work. It's only discovered until after they started their extraction and their mining. So we'd like to ensure that put this in place, that the GLUC approves of it prior to us even moving forward on questionable permits that are being submitted. So that is what we look for as far as permitting. So on section 1, the change of biological, from extractive industry to biological industry. This statement was actually prior to me listening earlier to earlier testimonies. So I'm going to go ahead and strike that out. Okay, so that actually answered questions. And to be honest with you, I wasn't privy to the information of prior, the prior hearing. Okay. So as far as the bill, we are in support with some recommended changes, and we will provide by the end of this week the revised testimony and provide to your office. So there was actually questions submitted by your office to the director. Actually, several questions. So question 1 was, although we did not receive a response from DPW requesting for information on permits after the hearing in 2022, does DPW concur with the list provided by DLM and Guam EPA as a number of quarry sites, as well as those with clearing and grading permits on larger properties? Yes, we concur. Has DPW suspended, denied renewal, or application for clearing and grading applications for properties larger than 5 acres? Yes. DPW denied renewal of Smithbridge, Guam for permit G16-142 for activities on the Guam Raceway Park on July 28, 2020. Were any NOVs issued by DPW? NOV was issued to quarrying activities not related to the Guam Raceway Park, located near the Mangilo Solar Farm and Marble Cave area. So that again was an actual, a permit was issued for clearing and grading, and we actually found out that they were actually extracting and mining. So we issued a notice of violation to that, and activity had stopped. The next question was on what grounds? For Smithbridge, expired GLUC notice of action and the grading permit issued is not for extraction activities that were being conducted. So, yeah. On Mangilao, clearing and grading was authorized, not quarrying. So we stopped them from that too. How were they resolved? Smithbridge, there was no resolution due to expired facilities lease, and activity has ceased. In Mangilao, operations have ceased. No more activities occurring in that area. Do you believe this bill closes the gap for quarry applications, since under this proposal, it would be a conditional use in M2 zones rather than allowed outright. So proposed section 61310B3 adds mining or quarrying to include section 61304B7 that allows biological extractive industry to occur in AA rural zones. Assuming that the definition of a biological extractive industry is mining or quarrying, the proposed section 61310B3 is not limited to M2 industrial only. Either zones may be capable of that activity. Sorry. The printout cut off, I'm sorry. Okay, assuming that a definition of biological extractive industry is mining or quarrying, the proposed section is not limited to M2 heavy industrial zones only. Either zones may be appropriate, however, the decision should be made by GLUC to determine if the location is suitable based on any future development plans or residential surroundings. Next question was, has DPW in the past issued quarry permits for quarries that didn't go through the GLUC that you were aware of? As far as I know, DPW is not aware of any quarry permits that were issued without GLC NOA. Do you have any recommendations for the definition of quarry or quarrying? Our definition would be surface extraction of limestone aggregate for use as building materials. So that was the last of the question. Again, we will submit in by tomorrow revised testimony based on the information that we received today from this hearing.
I appreciate that, Mr. Romero. Thank you for being here this morning and for your testimony, and I apologize. The link for our previous hearings are all online, and we will send those to you for sure. All right, I just want to clarify the bill. If the bill maybe, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Section 1 of the bill is amending the section of the code that is agriculture zone. So currently it says extractive industries allowed in an agriculture zone, and the land management has been using this language to allow for mining in an agriculture zone. Our intent is to change it to biological extractive industry. So mining will no longer be allowed in a agriculture zone if this bill is passed. That will change. And we've got a couple definitions. We've got one proposed by BSP that I appreciate. So we'll probably try to incorporate that. Now, Section 2, this is the M2 zone, and we have put in, as part of the conditional uses allowed in an M2, mining or quarrying. So we've received testimony today, maybe M1 we should consider instead of M2, and because M1 allows for residential use in the neighborhood of quarry, and M1 also allows for commercial purposes in the same area, right? So I think that's the logic behind that, and we can talk more about that. But for both, it would be a conditional use, and that means that it's not automatic, that they would have to apply for Guam Land Use Commission conditional use application that will allow for the public to be informed and all of the adjacent neighboring areas. All right, so Section 3 of the bill, this limit is a limit, it's a 5-acre limit put on clearing and grading, not on quarries. So this is how I was hoping to distinguish between clearing and grading and a quarry, and that is by putting an actual acre limit on clearing and grading. And this I got from Hawaii. Their limits are actually 15 and 20 acres for clearing and grading, and then they allow the directors to give more if they find it reasonable and all protections have been put in place. So that's what I tried to do, but I brought it down a lot from 15, 20 that they use in Hawaii to 5 on Guam, because 5 is only 30 miles long, right? And our area is just so much smaller, so I try to make that compatible. Yes. So this, again, is an attempt not to limit the size of a quarry necessarily, but to help everybody distinguish or, be able to treat any excavation greater than 5 acres as something different than clearing and grading. Because that was the biggest concern I heard, was that the clearing and grading is what they are using to quarry. A clearing and grading permit is actually what they've been using to quarry. And we want to prevent that. We want everybody on the same page to make it clear. So if you can maybe just look at that again with that in mind. So this is a rule that's correct that currently is administered by the Guam EPA. So this is the administrator who is referred to in this rule is the administrator of EPA. And it's the administrator of EPA who, by this new rule, would be able to reduce the 5-acre limit based on the circumstances, or increase the 5-acre limit based on the circumstances. And that is to, help them with their current, in their current capacity as the regulators. All right. And then Section 4 of the bill is our attempt again at defining mining and quarrying, right? So we're treating them the same. Mining or quarrying shall mean. And I appreciate the recommendations that were made by Department of Ag to include them as part of this process, and DPW. So this says that we're trying to create a special permit. That's what the recommendation that was made at our last hearing was, a special permit, so that it's treated differently and that all the protections come in. And I think, Mr. Johnson, this is consistent with what you brought up, that you are a quarry, you are treated differently, and you have federal rules and all these things to comply with. But the issue was that we had clearing and grading permits that were not being required to comply with those rules. So we want to make a very clear distinction. A special permit would allow the Guam land use, well, I like the recommendation that the land use will approve that, although they are approving that use on the empty property already, right? And then the permitting process comes in. What my concern, and I have no objection to including Department of Ag and the other agencies that DPW has listed. You're the one who knows best who can contribute, so I'm glad to do that. And then Section 5 of the bill says that DPW, so these are the ones I really want your help with, is DPW shall promulgate and enforce rules for the application and issuance of the clearing and grading permits. And this is consistent with the 22 GAR Chapter 10 Guam Soil and Sediment Control Regulations in 5 GCA Chapter 9. So we do have statute regulating clearing, grading, but that's contained in the Guam Soil and Sediment Control. What we don't have, I think, are rules in your permitting process that match that allow you to also revoke a permit or give a notice of violation if they exceed the protections. And then I put in a sentence that because of my experience with the Guam Land Use Commission, that says no permit may be issued without conformance to all requirements and conditions of the Application Review Committee agencies. So the Application Review Committee agencies, all of you have been putting on your comments, like this should happen before this permit is granted, but we need to enforce that, and so I'm putting it here that DPW does not release a permit without those conditions actually being fulfilled or met. And then the last one, of course, is EPA. They also authorized to promulgate rules setting the environmental standards for clearing and grading in accordance with 5 GCA Chapter 9. That's the administrative adjudication law. So I'm not trying to take away anybody's authority to promulgate rules, but I am trying to fast track our ability to enforce, whether it's clearing and grading or mining, because that's the big issue. That's, and I really want to know, I'm not sure now that WERI is not part of the ARC review committee, as far as I know. right? And so maybe I'll start with Weary. Does Weary have you said that there should be some concerns with grading over. Grading over the recharge area?
Yes.
And so are you able to give to the Guam Land Use Commission or the permitting agencies that information so that they can enforce it? Or how does that work?
We do have a surface hydrology map that we just recently developed from all the hydrologic assessments we've been doing. So we did a big map for the whole northern Guam for the limestone aquifer. And that points out a lot of the where the plateau is that brings recharge and the surface depressions that capture the water and how it runs into these surface depressions, and we've defined all that. And now we've actually mapped the boundaries and everything. It's available on the Guam Hydrologic Survey website as a web map, so it's an interactive map that can be used by anyone to see. It's a good first assessment tool to identify potential sinkholes or recharge areas. And we've also can improve that map to add into their agriculture areas and or parcels and boundaries. And we have that kind of technology available now for us as web maps and
All right.
kind of things.
Is there any one of the agencies here who uses that as part of their review process? All right. I'll take,
Madam Speaker, so we use a whole bunch of decision support tools, and the Weary hydrological maps is one of the ones that we use to help kind of understand the conditions of the northern Guam lens aquifer. So the resolution on that is quite extensive, and for most projects in the north, you know, the kind of the benchmark to protect waters is almost equal. So it's hard to look at the different layers and distinguish between the different water quality types and say that one is less than the other. We treat it as all important.
all what?
All important.
Important.
Because you have like Bezo and all these other different classes where like, so it's a
they're
really
able-
fine look at the different types of water quality systems in the north, but very useful tool.
All right. Are you able to determine if a certain lot is used as a quarry, that has a higher impact to, or a higher likelihood to impact the recharge area?
Yes, we've done that we've done that for determining when we get called to do a hydrogeologic assessment of an area that's going to be developed and it's going to be a major change and grading. We always inspect the sinkholes. Are they close to production wells, things like that? We have the whole entire inventory. It's the most well-developed map about our groundwater system.
Okay.
And we have yet to train and share. There's been a lot of breaks in between that we couldn't, we had the pandemic, but that technology and our information is available, but we just need to reach out more. And we have some workshops and plans ahead to share these new information.
All right. Yeah, my concern is that it's when you're invited, you're able to do that, and if you're not invited, then that information is not part of the planning process, except while these agencies voluntarily take it up. But, excuse me, I'm going to allow Senator Taitui, if you have any questions before you go. I know you have to go.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Not really any questions, but I just wanted to thank you so much for being engaged in this very important issue that we're having on Guam. You know, the 5 mile that you, the 5 acres radius that you were talking about, I'm curious too about that. However, you know, you might not have that in other jurisdictions because the land mass is so much larger than Guam. You know, we have to put a limit to how much that acreage is on any kind of, you know, grading or quarrying. That's important because what we're starting to see is that, you know, our island that once had a lot of hills or, you know, mountains or, you know, are now being stripped. I'd hate for us to have to go into our oceans and strip quarry. I mean, the coral from there just to get rock that's needed for this military buildup that's coming on board. We've seen it in other islands where they've actually stripped coral to get rocks. And that's not what should happen here. And I really appreciate that everybody's here to understand there is an issue. There is an issue. So we need to address it. And Senator Brown, she had to go to another meeting as well as I have to, but you know, she had a lot of good comments that she wanted to bring up and concerns. And I know that the speaker is trying to address this, fast track this. This is something that we're not going to stop, you know, looking into. If you think we're going to have this round, you know, public hearing and then forget about it and nothing's going to happen, then you're mistaken. Because this is an issue today where I was glad to hear that, you know, Hawaiian Rock is being very careful on the limestone forest. We have a very unique island here that filters our water, our drinking water, through these limestones. We have one of the largest quarries in Dedido, in an area that's very close to our aquifer. It's huge in Liguan. Not Liguan, I'm sorry, Kaiser, right? That's more Kaiser. We need to put limits. But most especially, we need to enforce these rules that once put in place, and any kind of funding that's needed, we're going to have to find this funding. Even if it means, and I'm a Republican, taxing, you know, these companies that strip our land. So it's something we need to address now, and I'm very grateful to the speaker for not stopping, you know, the momentum on this. I mean, we had it in April, but I'm sure there's going to be more to come. So I'm looking forward to your written testimonies, especially from EPA, any kind of, and revisement from DPW. What I would like to see, Madam Speaker, is the testimony from Department of Land Management, because EPA mentioned that they want to put the regulations or the enforcing agent on, or the requiring agency on Guam Land Use Commission. It makes sense. You know, anybody putting any kind of permit, it makes sense. But I think EPA should be right, you know, shoulder to shoulder with them. I think every regulatory agency should, to protect our island. So other than that, I'm looking forward to, especially in that section of the 5 acres, you know, to discuss that further. So thank you for the opportunity, and I have to apologize. I have to leave.
Thank you, Senator Taitakui. I'd like to recognize Senator Perez and Senator Kanata for being here. Senator Perez, if you have any questions or comments. I have some more, but I'll come back later. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for spearheading this issue, something that I was also interested in doing as well. So, I mean, maybe it's, if I can ask to be a co-sponsor at some point. But yeah, I just, you know, I was hearing the testimony provided, and I'm really glad that the speaker included WERI, because it's important to have that framework when we're talking about quarrying, because this is a non-renewable resource, right? The land underneath this is non-renewable. You know, we look at examples of other islands, Nauru, for instance, right? They've mined their phosphates to the point where now they can no longer live on that land. And so, you know, we really need to take this resource and manage it properly and make sure there's proper regulations for it. And again, you know, not all substrate is made equal, but I just also want to point out that, you know, the island that we're on took millions of years to develop. It's a natural wonder. In fact, it was created, it's much older than the Himalayan mountains. I mean, if that's correct, I recall seeing some of those geological timelines from WERI, and it dated Guam to be older than the Himalayas, which I thought was really interesting. And that the fact that a lot of the substrate beneath us was made from millions upon millions of tiny organisms that deposited their shells, and which is now where we have the luxury of extracting our drinking water. It's truly a natural wonder. And we could talk about other islands, how beautiful they are, right? Guam is beautiful, but what we have here is water. And to undermine this natural resource, the substrate beneath us, is also undermining our ability to sustain ourselves on this island. And I really appreciate the speaker for spearheading this effort, and I appreciate all of you here, because we are, I think as we move forward, we need to keep this in mind. If we're thinking about not just our generations, but many generations to come. I too, once our island was forested by native limestone forests, and now we're down to the last 5%, is that correct? Or last 5% of what we have in forest is limestone.
Sorry, Senator, a fifth.
A fifth. And so, we're talking about rapid demise. If you hear of the concept of tragedy of the commons, right? This idea that what's in the public control ultimately gets utilized, and nobody's really controlling the degradation or preventing the degradation of it. And so, I think this unfortunately may be happening, but we don't, obviously there's still time to put a stop to this process of degradation, degradation, continual degradation that can lead to this concept of the tragedy of the commons, which is making this island unsustainable for us by undermining our drinking water source and all the habitat that our species, our flora, fauna, and ultimately us. It ultimately undermines our ability to sustain ourselves here. So I do look forward to more work on this, and I thank you for all your participation. Tzus Masi.
Tzus Masi, Senator Perez. Senator Kanata?
Hopefully, good morning, colleagues, and good morning to the panel. Certainly, we have a troublesome issue with the supply and demand for coral. It's certainly been considered white gold in some instances. So I am here to hear out the testimony. I'm still looking at some of the documents that were given to me, so I don't have any questions right now, but I thank you guys for coming this morning, and I look forward to hearing more discussion on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'm wondering if EPA can expand a little more. This is my concern, is that we've all expressed concerns about the clearing and grading or quarrying in the guise of clearing and grading, right? That was the concern at the last roundtable. We're trying to address that. I very much appreciate your recommendations as to the definition of quarrying. I think that's great. It's going to be very helpful. But one of the other issues that we were talking about was who is enforcing what. And so I was trying by this bill to coordinate all of you. Yes, you can sit down and you can do that without this bill and coordinate your own rules and regs. However, under the current process, if the Guam Land Use Commission, it was clear, the Guam Land Use Commission had no kind of boundaries, except if they say it's clearing and grading, then they will treat it that way, except for EPA's Soil and Erosion Authority, right? And BSP's authority is also limited, and so they're limited to determining whether it's consistent with the land use plans, right? In a large regard. Department of Ag said they were limited to determining whether it affected an endangered species. But we really want a whole broader approach, I hope, that would say this is right next to agricultural land, and it is going to affect that in these ways or not affect it. If the runoff preventions are in there and all of that, takes care of adjacent landowners, then that might be okay, but I don't think that that's been the case in what we've seen. So we want to really give everybody authority that they might need, particularly starting with the Land Use Commission and the Guam EPA. So I don't know, EPA, maybe if you could talk to me, Chief Bearden, about, you gave us a definition of quarrying. You said you do not agree that we should make some of these changes, including, you do not agree that mining or quarrying shall require a special permit?
Well, we believe that it should require the permit that it requires right now, which would be that conditional use approval through the Land Use Commission, which I guess I was a little bit wrong on that because it sounds like that wasn't required under the M2 zone, but it sounds like you're making it required. I think that that's all that would be required in that case, because it still requires a grading permit. It still has to meet all the requirements under the Guam EPA regulations, which are very extensive, very technical regulations. But again, the big missing component in our view from looking at this and being an active, participant in the trenches of this is that it's that Land Use Commission approval, which, I congratulate Hawaiian Rock. They are the ones that go through that, but we see so many others that don't. So that to me is where we don't need any additional special type of permit because it already exists. We just have to make sure they don't have that loophole anymore that they can jump through to get out of that. And that's where that definition, I think, comes into play.
Maybe that's where I am getting confused now, because no, there is no special land use approval that you need to clear and grade your property. You only need a permit.
Oh, yeah,
You don't
not
go
for
through
clearing and
that.
grading.
We are creating a process where they can no longer automatically, in an agricultural zone, get a, or be allowed mineral extraction. They can only do it as a conditional use in an M1 or an M2 zone. We're going to clarify that, right? So the recommendation today is M1. Our bill says M2. So in either an M1 or M2 zone, that will be conditional use, but that's not the permit either. So what we're trying to do is also help you in the permitting and in the soil and water, your enforcement authority there, because your authority is very broad, and it's clearing, grading, grubbing, filling, excavation and embankment, and stockpiling, right? But what we heard was that because that's what they say they're doing, they're clearing and grading, you are treating it as clearing and grading, and the quarrying protections are not being put in place by those companies. So we're trying to help you to make them more truthful, I guess, and that's one of the reasons behind the amount of acreage. That's how the other states have done it, is by acreage. So if you have another recommendation of how to, it's to avoid any confusion between clearing and grading and the extra protections that come in when they are mining, which I agree, you guys are able to enforce.
So I guess I'd have to ask a question back to you just to clarify then is what additional protections do you envision that we would have beyond what we already have, which are very broad? I mean, everything that we have in our regulations would cover everything I'm aware of that occurs in a quarry. We have fuel tank regulations, we have hazardous materials
Yes,
regulations.
the protections in a quarry, but I'm trying to make sure that they are defined as a quarry.
Yes, and we agree 100% with that.
Okay.
But again, from our perspective, we're going to issue this permit based on what we see. If it's a giant hole in the ground that has quarrying activities, we are going to be putting conditions into our permit. And we have the ability already under our existing regulations to add conditions into any permit. And we have a very robust permit authorization letter system now that we give to DPW. It's like 10, 12 pages full of conditions. So if we see that it's a specific type of activity that's going to require some special conditions, we add those in. We have a whole kind of catalog of conditions we've pre-written for these. The issue with the quarries and not being identified, and this is where, not to get too sidetracked or not, but one of the reasons this came up, right, was because we were getting so many complaints that we were holding up clearing and grading permits for these people that really were engaged in quarrying. And the reason we were doing that was because there is a provision in our existing regulations that says that one of the application documents must be other agency approvals, and it specifically called out letters, conditional use approval letters for quarrying activities. And so the way it was written in such a way that it somewhat gave us the authority to look at these things and decide if it was quarrying or not. So that's where we started to run into this problem, where the land DLM, which reviewed it at first, Lands Management, they said, no, it's just grading, it's not quarrying. We looked at it and said, well, it's very obvious this is quarrying. I mean, you can tell looking at this. I tend to disagree some with what DPW said, that oftentimes we don't know until after they start. No, usually we know at the moment they apply, because you can tell from their grading plans that this is not, you know, clearing a pad for a house. This is a quarrying operation. So that's where we started running into this problem, was that we were calling these out as quarries, and we were placing these applications on hold as Guam EPA, not as DPW, and then telling the contractor that, hey, this is quarrying, come back to us with your land use commission approval letter, conditional use approval letter, and that's where it was holding things up. And we had all kinds of course, pressures and such from all directions to release those, and that's where this kind of came about. So back to your question, I do believe that our regulations are so well written, at least in terms of the general permitting of earth-moving operations, that we can permit them adequately. The issue with calling them out as a quarry is, in my opinion, more of that land use approval thing, and letting the neighbors have a say, letting the public have a say, and triggering other reviews as well, right? I mean, those permits go through agriculture, they go through the other agencies, but it's mostly that public component that's missing, that I believe so. And on your, before you get too far, I do want to mention on the size restriction you're proposing, 5 acres. Again, I don't think that changes anything in our law, especially by giving the administrator the ability to increase that, because we have a lot of those provisions written into the regulations. If you give the ability to waive something, it will be waived. You just have to basically count on that. But what I will tell you is that there is already a threshold that is very real for, and you can ask Hawaiian Rock too, if you exceed 1 acre is a threshold now, you trigger the federal construction general permit under the US EPA NPDES permitting system. That then triggers US Fish and Wildlife Review, as well as Section 107 SHPO consultation. So that is one of the bigger thresholds, I guess, for all development on Guam, that once that gets exceeded, you're automatically committing that developer to a whole extra level of review and documentation that they have to provide. So to me, the 5 acre thing is, it might find some quarries, it'll definitely find some large projects that are not quarries, but we saw, when I first got here in 2018, we were getting these continual applications by these small equipment rental companies to clear and grade smaller properties, like a 3/4 of an acre, 1 acre, 1.5 acres, clearly just for quarrying purposes. We put all those on hold at the time. I think they all just sort of disappeared. I think they decided not to act on it. But what I'm saying is that the 5 acre limit is both too big and too small at the same time, and I don't necessarily think that it's useful in this case.
All right, well, I only put that in because I tried to see what they did in other jurisdictions, and that's what they did. But I hear you. So if you're able, please help me, because so if we define quarrying, as you've suggested, and we require the Guam land use to have to make a determination whether this is going to be allowed or not as a conditional use in this M1 or M2 zone. So they will have a public hearing. For me, having a public hearing, when you say also that it poses a threat to health and safety, right, that quarries do, that a public hearing doesn't overcome that. So yes, we're hoping your strict permitting is going to overcome that. And you're saying that you can, but when we had the hearing before, you said that was the issue, that applicants are engaged in quarrying, but claim that they are not. And the land use permitting body has stated that they do not know how to respond or to make that determination. So, and your permitting comes after their approval or non-approval. So for me, I want that to be different.
So, I agree with you there, and that's why I mentioned in my spoken testimony earlier that we agree that there may be some changes that could be made to our regulations. One of those would be to the slopes, and that's where we talk about the threat to life and safety, right? A lot of these quarries are creating vertical slopes.
Yes.
They're cliffs. They're 80, 100 feet high. Someone could walk along, fall off one of those. Someone could jump off one of those. They create a hazard that wasn't there before. And that's something that I didn't get to yet, but we do. It's in our responses to your questions in here. And we would recommend talking among a number of stakeholders about what type of slope requirements there should be. We have slope requirements written into our regulations, but again, there's a way out of that by providing a supporting engineer's soil report, right? And slope analysis is a very narrow part of the engineering profession. There's very few people on Guam that can do it properly, but even them, they can provide, especially for competent limestone slopes, they can provide adequate justification and evidence that a vertical slope will not fall over in a reasonable time frame and it's not going to be a risk to safety. But there's other things that slopes are dangerous for, and that's for, again, falls and people falling off. There are standards, off the top of my head, I can't tell you what those are, but there are standards to prevent that type of hazard by providing certain types of minimum slopes and flat benches every so often. These are things that could be put into law, regulation. My recommendation would be if this is something that you are concerned with as a policy matter, that it be put into the law without that ability to let an engineer waive it. Because if you put that ability in there, it will be waived. That's just the way regulations work. People will find a way to waive it. But you also need to talk to the other stakeholders too, because if you're worried about quarrying, destroying more habitat, more limestone forest, if you restrict the amount of rock that someone can take out of a particular property by making the slope less steep, you basically are saying that we're going to then require you to move elsewhere to make it wider, longer, find new property to quarry in. So there's going to have to be a balance. And that's where we're recommending in our response back to you that this be more of a discussion among the stakeholders. And maybe this is something that would be better to occur through regulation, through that process, so it would give more time. But there may be a way for you as the policymakers to put in something, a stronger statement of policy in the law that would guide the regulators to making a good decision in that respect. So that's what I was getting at when I was talking about the threats to life and safety. Threats to groundwater, quality as such, those are pretty well covered under our existing regulations. One piece that hasn't been mentioned today at all is that we also have, under the wellhead protection regulations that Guam EPA has, which have problems and they need to be changed, there are restrictions on the depth of excavations that are clearly aimed at quarries. Unfortunately, the way that regulation was written in 1990, it did not use the same terminology as our groundwater protection zone, and that's one of the biggest regulatory tools. So when you're asking whether or not we use UOG's maps, we use them as our basic knowledge, but our regulatory tool is that groundwater protection zone map, which was developed back in the 80s and was actually created by land management and signed in 1997, I believe. So within that zone, that's where we would hold things to a higher degree of control, activities such as quarrying. Hawaiian Rock, Smith Bridge quarries, right now they're outside that groundwater protection zone. It's really interesting, you look on our GIS mapping system that we have in our new digital permitting system that Guam EPA uses, and it shows where the boundary of that groundwater management zone is, and especially when you look along the east coast of the island along Route 15, you can see the boundary of the Hawaiian Rock quarry just curving right around that groundwater protection zone. Smith Bridge, the same thing. And so that, at least at one time, that boundary was very meaningful, it meant something, and it was protected. I think for a period of time, 10, 15 years ago, maybe things slipped and things were permitted inside those areas that shouldn't have been permitted. But that's our main tool, and I think we should hold to that. So we do have restrictions on the depth of the excavations that can occur in there as well. There's restrictions on other things, the uses of hazardous materials, the uses of fuel, storage of fuel, that kind of thing. The things we would worry about in a quarry mostly are going to be those types of issues, right? You can dig a clean hole into clean limestone, rain falls on it, it's not going to make much of a difference to groundwater. What's going to make a difference is if you let a whole bunch of dirty surface water runoff come into there and then bypass all that filtration it would have gotten, or if you allow a bunch of industrial uses to occur inside that area, storage of fuel, improper storage of fuel, spills, vehicle maintenance activities, that's where we have the concern. And those are fairly well covered by existing regulations right now. So that's what I was getting at there,
Okay.
if that makes sense. And I'm happy to go back and forth.
No, I appreciate that.
And you've made some good points too, just so you make sure I'm trying to be as respectful as possible. I really respect what you're trying to do here.
I want to make this work, and I of course want to do everything faster than slower because we have limited terms, and if we can't move it, we don't know how many years it will take to move it. And for me, I know you said why you think this came to light was because of the pressure EPA was receiving to approve permits for us. It came to light for me because of what we just see. We can see. Look at that. Looks like a quarry, but if you research it, it was clearing and grading, and it doesn't make any sense to us lay people how that was permitted, and I want to make sure that we're doing our part to make sure that that's not what you want or you intend, and that we give you all the tools to enforce what you do.
We agree 100%, and I know Edwin over here, back when I first arrived, he asked me to come over and give a presentation at some sort of a coastal zone meeting of some sort, and after just a few months on island, I listed like 2 of the biggest environmental problems on the island were what I called at the time stealth quarries and stealth subdivisions, these developments that were occurring without the proper permitting, that were bypassing Guam's existing laws and regulations, and so we agree 100%.
Thank you. I think I heard that. I think I heard one of your presentations, so maybe that's what motivated me. But yes, so that's exactly what we're trying to do here. It's that. Senator Barnett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I commend you for this effort, especially given Guam's finite land resources, and I defer to our Environment Chair. Thank you. Okay, sorry, she already asked a question. So thank you to the panel for attending. It's been very informative. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
All right, so anyone else have anything else to add? Yes, Director Chelsea Munoz.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I wanted to add that perhaps what we could also do, and even maybe within your timeline, if we could maybe have 2 sort of informal roundtable conversations where we can flesh things out together a little more clearly and define some of the more rigorous standards we'd like to impose. And one that comes to mind is the conservation standards that you mentioned. I think it's in Section 3. We'd like to maybe flesh out what is defined as conservation standards, and if those need to be amended or changed, and also impose either mitigation requirements or a more strict a fee associated with the loss of habitat, because it's not coming back, and what are we going to do to mitigate that for our island? And also, I'd like to share with your group, I can't open it right now, but what was shared with me in April recently and was brought to my attention is that at one point, I think it was in the late 90s, the Army Corps developed a manual for development in the Pacific Islands, and in it are defined and outlined nature-based solutions for some of the issues that even today plague us that we hadn't ever properly addressed in alignment with our ecological habitats. So maybe those are some of the recommendations we can put into the conservation standards that would be required for any special permits or updating to this process that's needed.
What is your authority if it is an ecological habitat or?
So that was actually brought up by the former DAR administrator when I've talked about this with him, Mr. Jerry Davis, that I kept saying that I feel so hampered by the fact that all we have is the authority to address ESA, and he was referring me to go back and start looking at the Organic Act, because when he read that, there's a section that he fully pulled from that broadened his authority to encompass all aspects of natural resources for Guam, so that it wasn't just limited to ESA. And that's something I'm working on. It's just on the list of things to get through. But I mean, we are the agency that is mandated to protect Guam's natural resources, along with those who are here as well. But I think it's more so of the intent to broaden our or that it's, I think over time it's become narrower and narrower, but not through any formal method, but the thinking that had limited it to that.
All right. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the land reclamation requirements, or what does that entail? So that's for quarrying, if it is a quarry?
Yeah, so that was something that we were recommending, that's something that could be added to Guam EPA's regulations. I think we could do that as a permit condition now regardless, but it's something that should be put in there, and that would be to restore that quarried land to a vegetated state, to provide screening of cuts for visual purposes, to provide slopes that were more safe and provided benches, that kind of thing. We did this up in CNMI with some of the quarries there as well, but I think that was written into the regulations with some final restoration requirements. That's something that we do believe could be added to the regulations now. I think Jesse maybe had something else to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Speaker. To that, we wanted to say if you could add a beneficial reuse or closure plan to these properties, because as you notice, we don't want to see holes in the ground or unvegetated areas. And so that could be one of the things to be added to the bill. Also, proposing a fee schedule, because like Captain Beard mentioned, a lot of this is unfunded mandates for reviews of the agencies and everything along those lines. So maybe a fee schedule for the special use permit that would help the reviewing agencies and support its use and review on that. One of the things that we would like to support is that we understand the need for this material to support the growth and development of all industries on Guam, but there should be a maximum volume that should be extracted, similar to all other protected resources. So we have limits on areas to be cleared, for harvesting of forests and things along those lines. So we were alluding to it earlier that there's only certain areas on Guam that the industry would like to use that meets their specific criteria for construction. And those areas are limited, and the volumes of those materials are limited. And so along those lines, we're thinking that there should be a maximum volume extracted, because if island-wide or in a certain area. And Captain Bearden alluded to it again, that there is a maximum depth for quarries that should be there, but there should be, we're thinking something along the lines, a maximum volume for the entire island should be quarried. Because like you said, we're 202 square miles, and we're losing forests and we're losing all that material. One of the other things that we would like to see is instituting a reuse or recycle rate of construction demolition debris to be incorporated into the construction industry and not solely reliant on the use of new material. That this will help reduce the impact to the environment and potentially help in waste reduction. So one of the other issues that we see, especially in light of the last typhoon, is that we're finding a lot of construction debris that we need to get rid of. The hard fills on island now, which we permit, do accept the material, but there is a limit to those volumes as well. And so if there could be a way for that material to be recycled and incorporated into existing construction processes, Chelsea alluded to of the glass, so there might be other ways for that to be incorporated into it as well. And then the last would be, again, it's a finite resource, the quarrying materials on island that would be needed, and there are existing regulations for the importation of extracted material, so maybe there's a way to expand those to be able to bring it on island so that we're not solely reliant on what is on island, and to ease that burden. We don't want to have a similar process to like Speaker Perez said of what happened in Nauru, where they just mined the entire island for profit. This is our only island, and we want to make sure that it's protected, so that's why we're thinking along those lines. Recycle, reuse, the maximum volume to be extracted, and expand the importation of regulations for aggregate. Thank you.
All right. Is Guam EPA able to work on the particulars of those recommendations a little bit more, or how would you propose we go about that?
You know, we're not the subject matter experts on that, but it was just, you know, a thought process that we were going through. But we definitely will reach back to US EPA, our other counterparts and whatnot to see to how to incorporate, especially the recycle reuse on that. But
Sure.
we would definitely be partners in that.
All right. I mean, I like all those ideas, and I'm willing to explore those. Senator Perez.
Yeah, thank you, Speaker. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to this discussion because the bill that we passed, the Zero Waste Act last term, does allow for you know, diversion of waste, and I'm hoping that maybe this fund, the Recycling Revolving Fund, can be used for those purposes, that what we're discussing right now. So it's very much within the purview of Guam EPA. So perhaps this is a follow-up discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And Vice Speaker, or I'm sorry, Speaker, this is exactly what I mean. Like if we could have at least maybe 2 sessions, I think, at a minimum, for us to convene together, and we have the same ideas, so it would just be much more efficient. And I understand we all have the email and all of that, but I think there's so much more that happens if we can have these conversations together.
Thank you. I did, Mr. Johnson?
Can I just make a comment about the
course.
limiting of the amount of, you know, it really depends on what's happening on the island. Yes, the next 10 years, you know, there's going to be a large demand for aggregate. But, you know, I caution you, the importing of aggregate costs 5 to 10 times more expensive than you know, using the local aggregates in construction. And that cost is going to be passed on to, you know, homeowners and everybody. So it's not, I don't think it's really realistic. You know, we go through these cycles in construction where, you know, there's a lot of construction going on, there's a need for aggregate. That will end, and it'll get back to a normal periods when this military buildup is over. And as long as the quarry is permitted properly, and there's that amount of material there that can be used during these peak periods, and I don't see why you would limit the total aggregate, you know, the total on the island. There is a lot of usable aggregate that can be quarried without destroying limestone forests. So,
Have you, in other areas that Hawaiian Rock operates, is there, have you ever seen limits on the maximum volume for a state or?
no, I don't believe so. Yeah.
What about, have you seen limits on the number of quarry sites?
Well, you know, we only, you know, my personal experience is only here and in the CNMI, and no, you know, quarries, you know, there is an issue on quarries in even in the U.S. mainland, because what's happened is when these quarries were developed, they were out in the middle of nowhere, and as, you know, as development starts occurring and getting closer and closer to quarries, it's no longer feasible for a lot of quarries to operate because they're too close to development. But so that has to be taken into consideration on our islands. We're using different methods now of mining the rock, where we still drill and blast in some areas, but we have these mining machines now that we can basically shape the quarry as we go down, and we can put these slopes that Captain Bearden's talking about, a nice slope, bench, nice slope. That's what we're looking at for the future expansion of our Fidian quarry. Yeah.
All right. We did receive testimony from David Herrera. I wanted to get your thoughts on it, so I'm going to read it out loud. It's very short. Testifies in favor of Bill 116-37 COR. If I may respectfully suggest that the minimal area is noted to be 5 acres, and for the mandate to apply on lot areas starting at the minimal 0.25 acres or 929 plus or minus square meters. The logic is that the general basic lots, after being processed, approved, and recorded by the Department of Land Management, may be, quote, a part of, unquote, a specific larger parcel that is identified to be permitted for grading, clearing, and excavated for mineral extraction. Specifically, if the quality of material on that 0.25 parcel or more is of the high quality topsoil other minerals or of a hard rock category as such that are found in the Fidian, Pagat, Mount Santa Rosa Ridge, and other coral outcrops on the southern area locations around Guam. I don't know, I'm curious about the part where they make a distinction between the quality of the rock and whether we should make limits on those areas, since those are the high demand areas. But I like in my mind, I like the fact that we use the map that Captain Bearden talked about. That was, you said you might update that or use something more updated, the groundwater protection zone map, and that WERI also has a separate map.
Yeah, there are efforts underway to look at updating that map, but the map itself is in place now. It's good. I think that any updates would just be a fine refinement. I think what I was mentioning was that we need to update the regulations that go with the map that would provide some of the regulatory requirements within that groundwater protection zone. Some of them stand in other regulations, but in one particular regulations, there's a lot of changes needed.
All right. And you're able to make recommendations for that, or you're going to do that as a part of EPA's process rulemaking?
It's going to be in the list of things that Guam EPA needs to do, yeah, in the near future. We're working on kind of the outline of it right now.
Okay, great. All right. Anyone else? Mr. Regis?
Maybe just I can use this opportunity to kind of plug the work that we're doing with the Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan, in which that will be enforceable by law. And when we're looking at establishing the future land use maps, we want to be able to make sure that we can characterize different features of the land, such as developing a scenic area of significant value standards, so we're able to quantify these special places, such as certain view sheds that we don't want impacted by development or mining. We want to identify areas of particular concern, such as these limestone stores, so we can make sure that we can look futuristically at planning and how to identify the limited space on the island for the best uses. And so we'll come up with these areas which we can, this is going to be a public process, so we hope that the industry will also be a part of this as well, so that we can look at being able to identify different areas of our land and delineate them so that they can be identified for their best uses. And that this comprehensive plan will be used as a decision-making tool to inform land use decisions. Just to really, and how that will relate to this is that if this bill does pass, we're hopeful that it passes in which the mining and quarrying is well-defined, and it's also elevated to a higher land use standards, and that will then allow for the review of these activities in a comprehensive manner that holds it to a higher standard of review. And so by moving it away from agriculture, I think it's a huge step. But also, we also have to think about how do we plan for the future from a comprehensive standpoint. And from a bureau standpoint, we're going to be working with our agencies and trying to rely on the best data and the research coming out of the university to be able to articulate the existing conditions that we would like to see in the future, well, existing conditions now, and then also our future alternatives of where we want our island and how we want that to shape in the future. I just had a quick conversation with my partner, my colleague Randy, and we do agree that defining mining and quarrying is something that really needs to be articulated. But perhaps there also could be strength in the bill by clearly giving DPW the authority or the requirement to uphold that definition. So maybe that could be a further discussion too, as we try to flesh out that language. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
What is the name of the plan that you said you're working on?
The Guam 2050 Sustainability Plan.
Sustainability plan.
So we've been talking about this for a while, and we have interior funding that we received, and we kicked off the planning process in February, actually April of this year. Obviously, there's been a pause because of the typhoon, but we are going to be rolling that out over the next 2 years. So stay tuned for that. We certainly welcome your involvement. We're just now getting to the point where we're reaching out to the agencies, but there's a lot of work that went into the pre-planning of this. such as looking at public sentiments per planning, looking at the regulatory controls currently that we have now, so that when we do work with EPA and Ag and DPW, we have context of what sustainability means. Right now, it's kind of maybe hard to put your finger on as a regulatory agency as a sustainable concept. So we're trying to make sure that we're not going in there talking about theories and we have actually something much more concrete. But we're getting ready to roll this out, and we'll be doing it over the next 2 years. Hopefully we can get this approved, and it'll of course be brought before this body for adoption.
All right, so you've talked about different areas, but I'm assuming that's going to include this groundwater protection zones,
Absolutely.
the endangered species zones, and if you can get habitats, right, mapped in there. I know, I look forward to that. And so, all right, well, I would like to move forward with a couple provisions of this bill, particularly items section 1 that removes this activity in an agriculture zone. Section 2, which depending on M1 or M2, requires a conditional use permit from the Guam Land Use Commission. So that, I think that would address everybody, and that would be consistent with current expectations for those who are quarrying. So for mining and quarrying, it would go through Guam Land Use Commission. They would have to get a conditional use under an M1 or M2 zone. I'm going to discuss that further. And then Section 3 is the area I'm going to need whatever input you want to submit. Please submit additional input regarding Section 3 and Section 4. And some of your written testimony says you don't agree with Sections 5 or 6, but I'm thinking that just allows you to promulgate and rules. This is Public Works, and this is Public Works. What I really want to see is Public Works, as Mr. Ray just suggested, that you are able, as the permitting agency, to enforce those permits as well. Because after Guam Land Use Commission's done with it, it's going to be only on your lap, pretty much, right? So something like that. If you need additional rules, this is the intent of this is to give you that authority. EPA, you've testified you don't need this authority. You have authority already to promulgate rules. And that you think that those are clear for grading, grubbing, filling, excavating, embanking, stockpiling, mining, and quarrying. I was not able to find any rules regarding mining or quarrying in your rules.
Yeah, quarrying and mining is not specifically mentioned, but they clearly fall under the definition of excavation.
So
it covers that. So to me, it's 100% covered under the existing regulations.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to ask each of you to work diligently to please submit any additional testimony and any additional provisions that you think we can cover under the same topics that we have discussed this morning, and to make it more efficient. And I very much appreciate all of your input, and hope we are all on the same page as we go forward. And I do want you as stakeholders to get together. I am willing to facilitate that. I think BSB has been good at facilitating that type of thing. My issue is, as the quarrying and mining, I want it to be taken care of immediately. I don't want to allow any other exceptions under pretense of clearing and grading to be approved, and then they end up quarrying, and then after the fact. I don't want any of that. I want to prevent it if we can by your additional recommendations. So I appreciate your input. And thank you again for all your work on this and all your work during this time of recovery. Situs Masi. This hearing will now be adjourned. It is 10:45 a.m. Situs Masi.